Okay, so here I'm going to be quickly debunking a fallacious claim by Charlie Kirk, and it's disturbing to see how many people actually cheer this on and parrot it mindlessly, but they don't seem to understand. I've had this discussion before with somebody else. The words objective or the word inherent or the word absolute, right? When it comes to morality and similar things. Let's see what he says again. They're dunking all over this kid and acting like it's a big thing, but let's just see what they say. I'll put the subtitles on.
I believe in objective morality, so that can apply to
Okay, objective morality. Let's just see what he says.
It's
But
not objectively wrong to leave a full-born baby by the fire and just.
and this is like almost a poor attempt at a gotcha question that the conservative side would almost condemn in like the mainstream media. They're trying to, like, he'll ask that always with the Holocaust. Was the Holocaust objectively wrong? Well, considering that you're a subjective human being, you can say it's subjectively wrong in your opinion, and then 99.999% of people can agree with you on a subjective level. And then collectively, the real question should be, how can we best go about preventing something like that from happening on the subjective level using our subjective means and resources? But on a more micro level, it makes more sense if you just look at it in a simple way instead of this failed attempt at a gotcha, like, oh, look, he can't say the Holocaust is bad, let's dunk on him. You're not really making any point at all, right? Because the conclusion would even be, regardless of, label, atheist, whatever you want to say, the conclusion would be you realize morality isn't objective or inherent or absolute, because then it would resolve itself outside of the subjective human realm, and your opinion on it and your whole back and forth and aggrandizing and all of this would be unnecessary. This is a form of social contrivance on the subjective level right here. The fact that you're stigmatizing and trying to reinforce, you don't realize that what is even happening right here is subjective. Right, everything you're saying and doing, this is all subjective. There's nothing wrong with that, but that creates a different standard. That's why you have subjective police officers, right, to enforce and uphold the law, which sometimes they make mistakes on the subjective level, right? So all of that shows you it's not objective. You have to create a law enforcement system, a court system, laws. You have to subjectively come up with all of this, right, made by flawed, imperfect, subjective people. Then the subjective cop has to go after the subjective culprit. Then you have to go to a subjective court with a subjective lawyer, a subjective judge. That's all fine, and that's the purpose of society to a degree. So the real discussion would be, how can we best achieve that functional state? How can we prevent people from doing these things that are subjectively wrong in the view of the vast majority of people? 99.9% of people agree. Then we come to a consensus, then we make laws. So on a practical, observable, everyday basis, you're seeing how it's subjective. You're seeing how, a subjective police officer, they might make a mistake. Maybe the killer will get away. So how is that objective? They subjectively messed up. They let him get away. Or we subjectively, you have corrupt cops. You have a court system that might let the culprit get away. They're not guilty. But that's all subjective, and it comes down to the human level. Here's an example of an objective claim, since nobody seems to understand what the word objective means. It doesn't mean that, you so badly want it to be true that it just becomes true, or that 99.9% of people agree with it, or that society can functionally try to uphold it, or that that's what should be believed. That it's not a should be. Objective would be inherent. The need to breathe oxygen is objective. So regardless of your view or debate, there would be no debate on the subject. You could say subjectively, you don't need to breathe oxygen, that's your opinion. But then if you put it to the test, you would die. So that would be self-evident, right? So you wouldn't need to prove it or debate it or make any big deal about it. It's just evident, self-evident, and you can see it to be true. Right, so when you say objective, inherent, or absolute, all terms that I've heard people like this use in this kind of context, it would mean that God, if you believe in God, for example, a God would strike you down with a bolt of lightning and prevent you from doing it, something like that, or wouldn't have made you with the ability to do it in the first place. That would be objective because it would be something outside of human control. It wouldn't rely on human subjective reinforcement and enforcement in the first place, right? And social stigma and indoctrination, it wouldn't rely on that. So the fact that it does rely on that means that it's worth upholding, but that's sort of an expression that I have. The best way to achieve something is to realize it's not true. Or sometimes the worst way to achieve something is to pretend, just because you want it to be true so badly, you pretend it already is true, and then you won't actually do what is best or necessary to uphold it. So you pretend killing a person is wrong, and 99.9% of people agree with that, obviously, and then society agrees and we enforce it and uphold the law. So on a practical, observable, everyday basis, you can see how it's subjective and it requires that subjective enforcement. So the real discussion would be, how can we best achieve that, right? How can we make laws better? How can we, whatever we need to do to make that achieved at the best level, which we do on a practical basis every day. But And the two layers, one is indoctrination and one is enforcement that I've always discussed both layers to try to prevent, undesirable behaviors. But yeah, if it was objective or absolute, God would strike you down with a bolt of lightning. So that would be outside of human control, or the laws of nature themselves would prevent you from doing it or address it, directly. So it wouldn't be that it would come down to some subjective human level. So that's where people just don't seem to understand what the word objective actually means, because your objective standard then is so strong that it happens anyway, right? He'll evoke the Holocaust. You could use like the Uyghur Muslims now, what's happening in China. So something is so objective that it comes down to, well, it can happen anyway. And what stopped it from happening? Subjective human beings coming in with their own resources and military and fighting it out and then ending it. So that's good that it ended, obviously, but the point being that you needed humans to subjectively, on their imperfect, flawed level, to address it themselves, either prevent it from happening or they're the ones who made it happen. So the fact that people are able to have that impact, right, it works better on a micro level, like killing a person is objectively wrong, you would say here. But then people can still do it, and people do it all the time. So all it takes to defy a supposed objective reality of the universe, right, an objective truth, is a person just feels like, you know what, I feel like doing something different. So they're having a bad day, they're mad, they're crazy, whatever. They go out, they kill somebody. So now your objective reality, your objective truth, it goes out the window. So your objective is so weak and trivial that it requires constant subjective reinforcement, indoctrination, constant upholding on a subjective level by subjective people, police, courts. Again, not diminishing it. That's just the reality of what we have to do, because it's not objective. We have to stay vigilant and actively uphold it, which is the whole purpose. This is like pretty elementary school understanding of how the world works. Like, rather than you just want something to be true, so you just believe it to be true. But if that was the case, okay, it's subjective, so then there's no need to debate it. You're right, Charlie Kirk, so let's just suspend laws and courts and police tomorrow, and it's so objective that, like, the need to breathe oxygen, it would just happen on its own. So you wouldn't need to uphold it on a subjective societal level, right? Why would we need to even have this debate? Why would we need to have, subjective, flawed, imperfect people upholding it, as society has to do, right? Just because people agree on it doesn't matter, right? You don't need that, because why should you need subjective enforcement of an objective standard? So you're not really understanding what it means. It's a poor attempt to kind of dunk on somebody. It's a poor attempt to do sort of a gotcha question. But again, if you were to say objective, even the title is a little deceptive. Like, you're not saying it's on a subjective level. Of course, you'd say it's wrong. And I don't know who this guy is. I don't really care, the kid, but you would say subjectively it's wrong because you're a subjective human being, just like he's a subjective human being. So you're kind of being a little full of yourself to think you can make an objective claim. But just to put it this way, your objective claim, or it wouldn't even be a claim then, it would be an objective observation of just objective reality, would be so weak that anybody could just defy it like that. So that's the real point too. Like, why would an event like that be able to happen then? Oh, it was objectively wrong. That's why it happened. That's why people were still able to do it. Why subjectively flawed, terrible, evil people, etc., right, between the H man, I won't even say his name, and the N group, right, of people, I won't even use these words, but like, they were able to, in their vile, subjective, terrible, corrupted, minds, their subjective will was able to do this horrible event. And it took the subjective will of others to either enable it, right, not prevent it from happening, allowing it to happen, etc., being afraid, etc., whatever the reasoning. But it took their subjective will to do it. It took other subjective, not stopping it. And then eventually it took other subjective humans to stop it. So I just think it's a semantics argument, and it's pretty weak, because the end result is, right, despite all the attempt at this pseudo nonsense, these comments are kind of irritating. Like, you're not getting, it's just a semantics nonsense, attempt at debate. The end conclusion in both cases is Charlie Kirk goes home at the end of the day and realizes that this objective morality requires subjective human reinforcement and upholding by police, by courts, etc. Right, so these are upheld by subjective human beings every day. He would go home knowing that that's the case. the other person would also do the same thing. I got to go home, and I know that, oh, I'm safe because I'm protected by subjective human law enforcement, etc. So both people, on a practical, observable, everyday basis, that's what's happening. And so we could debate how to best achieve that state, since that's the state that we live in, instead of, oh my goodness, it's subjective. But what does that do? What does it matter that it's subjective then? Because it still requires and comes down to subjective human enforcement and upholding on an active level, including what you're even doing here. It's such a weak. Let's just watch.
Say you're on your own. Have a nice life.
Well, yeah, I'm calling into question objective morality, so I obviously have
No,
to
I know. I'm
bite
just
that bullet.
trying to make you hear back how insane what you are saying.
It's insane to say that.
No,
The objectivity of it.
No,
You're
I know.
not
So
making
no,
a
no,
claim about whether it's wrong.
let's get
Obviously, I think it's wrong.
let's get more graphic. So
He even says it right there. Obviously, I think it's wrong on my subjective personal level. This is where society creates like the false inherent contrivance response state too that I talk about. Is if enough people believe something, that doesn't make it true. Like 99.9999% could agree, and then that gives society a backbone and a basis to say, this is why we have laws, and that's why we prevent it and enforce it. So rather than make it a simple this is like one of those weak, he's not a stupid person, and I respect him to some extent, but this is the worst framing possible. Like, you're trying to turn what could be a functional argument, like how can we best enforce and uphold our subjective morality using laws and courts and police and social stigma, indoctrination, parenting. How can we best achieve this on a functional level so we prevent people from doing things that are bad? And even as a society, governments and stuff, how can we prevent bad things from happening? Should we have more police? Should we have a better law system? Should we, we could discuss it on a functional level. But instead, you're trying to do this weird thing where you're saying, well, I'm just gonna, get people to, boo you and get emotional and act like, oh, but if you don't say what we want to be true, to be objective, then that's somehow your fault, and we'll get subjectively upset about it.
you put 1,000 Jews in a gas chamber, and the Nazis thought what they were doing was good, and they.
You just said it right there. They thought what they were doing was good, and they were able to do it. So, in other words, it's objectively wrong. But all it would take for it to happen again, or happen in the first place, would be subjective people can just think whatever they want, think that it's good, or that it's okay, and then they subjectively just do it. So what would it take? Would it take this insistence upon, well, it's subjectively wrong? So I guess the problem is it creates almost like this passive approach. Like, well, it's subjective, so we don't have to worry about it. It's subjective. It just goes without saying, so we can just sit on our hands, and it'll resolve itself, right? The laws of nature will stop it, or God will stop it. But it takes human effort and practice to stop it. So if you really looked at it, he would say, I'm going to stop it myself, or, government, we have to actively try to stop it and prevent it from happening. So all it would take is them just believing that they're right and they're good subjectively, and then they could do it, even though it's subjectively wrong. So you'll say that they're objectively wrong, but that doesn't stop the reality of it happening. What would stop the reality would be a functional subjective action.
Press the button. Were they right or were they wrong in gassing millions of Jews?
Objectively,
Like, when you say, is it objectively wrong?
I would just say I'm a subjective human being, so I would say, in my opinion, it's wrong. But it's a meaningless question. The distinction is pointless. Like, what does it matter? Okay, it is objectively wrong, but we still have to subjectively prevent it. Or it's subjectively wrong and we have to subjectively prevent it. It's the same conclusion.
If you say it's objectively wrong, you're implying that you can derive a truth value from it, and I don't think you can. So I don't think that you can make a true statement regarding whether
If it was
something's good or bad.
Got it.
If it was objectively wrong, it wouldn't be possible for it to happen. I don't think you know what that means. Like, okay, it's something is objectively wrong according to the laws of nature, so you can't do it. Nature prevents it from happening because it's wrong according to an objective standard, the laws of nature or the laws of God, so they wouldn't have allowed you to do it in the first place, or they would, again, address it inherently, strike you down with the bolt of lightning, etc. Or, again, the words absolute, inherent, or objective are all usable.
So just to be clear, the Nazis could have been right in their actions, in your view.
In your view, but that makes no sense because it's not your. And again, I don't know exactly what this guy's deal is, but could have been right in your view. Well, what you're really saying is you just said it yourself. You just said earlier it was right in their view. They thought what they were doing was good. So it's possible for their actions to be right in their view, that's how they were able to rationalize doing it to themselves, right? Like why they were able to do it. So yes, it's possible for them to subjectively believe what they're doing is okay. That's why they were able to do it. And it's also possible for them to subjectively enact such a horrible thing. So even the your view here is kind of a cheap shot because you're asking objective and then saying your view. It's possible in a subjective human view for anything to be the case, but that's the whole point of a collective enforcing its will. So 99.9% of people would agree subjectively that it's wrong and it shouldn't have happened and could have tried to prevent it, etc. So saying, oh, it could have been right in your view, but you're seeing that it was right according to their view. Their subjective view believed that it was right, unfortunately, and that's why it was able to happen.
Implies that right is an actual thing. I don't believe you can determine a truth value from a moral claim.
So the Nazis were not objectively evil.
Yeah.
Again, the word evil is even still subjective. Like, you're not understanding what you're really saying, but I get
I
it.
said that like 4 times. Like, yeah, you can't derive objective moral statements from like things. I'm not saying they're not wrong. Like, they are wrong. Oh.
Well, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
No, I just want to make sure this is important.
And he's being like in his opinion, like, oh my God, in his opinion, I'm not saying they're not wrong. I mean, that's obvious. It goes without saying. I would lead with that. They're wrong. It's terrible. It shouldn't have happened. That's my subjective view. And that's the subjective view of the majority of people. And that subjective view would be what it takes to stop it from happening again.
Because what you are saying, and you're saying it very clearly, is that we look at the Holocaust and it's just a matter of opinion.
It's a matter of opinion in the sense that, see, why would that be a threat to you? That's like social Darwinism, though. Yeah, 99.9% of people would agree, right, that it's bad. So, and we should try to prevent something similar from happening. And even at the time, people might have felt the same way, but it didn't stop it from happening. So that's the bigger concern. How do we stop it?
That's kind of the problem of being an atheist. You have to bite the bullet.
Not really a problem with it. Even I would disagree with him there, but I don't get it. Like, it's really stupid. Let's address some of these comments. We cannot scientifically prove objective morality. Most humans have good morals. Like, it's just a stupid point. Some of these people are defending it. Future of America. Like, you're not understanding the point. But no, I would just lead with that. In my subjective opinion as a subjective human being, it's wrong, obviously. Like, why wouldn't you say that? And then clear, consistent, and polite. Feels bad. See people get murdered. Can't understand. Yes, in my subjective, I guess people really don't know what the word objective means. They just don't get it. It's written in laws by subjective human beings. That's why it's subjective. Like, we have to have a subjective human being write this down in a law and enforce it. But that means it's subjective. So at the very least, like, whatever you think objective means is not very strong. So, okay, it's subjective. I agree. I concede the point. And in order to uphold that objective truth and reality of the universe, we have to be vigilant. We have to actively uphold it every single day. Again, social stigma, indoctrination, enforcement, police, courts. We need all that. And again, consisting of subjective, imperfect, flawed people, etc. We need all that, actively upholding it. Because that's how objectivity works, right? That it requires a constant subjective human buffer to be the case. If there's no God, you can't say it's subjective. It wouldn't even have to do with God, though. It could just be the laws of nature. Like, oh, it's subjectively wrong for something, that can't happen in nature. Title is misleading. It's wrong because of his moral view, not objective. Yeah, exactly. Not objectively wrong. Since at least some people have an actual brain here. Not objectively wrong, and it's just a gotcha thing. Their opinions. Doing property is considered wrong, but not objectively. But it makes it seem like, oh no, that means you're somehow defending it. Like, are you really this stupid? Yeah, the culture stuff. No one to run a mass. I mean, it ends up being the same point, but